Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, after the unthinkable happens, his phone often rings, with the voice on the other end saying, "We need you." I talk with Kenneth Feinberg, who was in charge of the compensation funds for the victims of the 9/11 attacks, the Deepwater Horizon spill, and the Virginia Tech shootings. Dialogue is next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today never planned the career he's had, but Kenneth Feinberg is now a self-acknowledged settlement guru. Over the past nearly 30 years, Feinberg, an arbitrator and mediator, has blazed a new trail in the area of tort law, that is, compensating victims for wrongs committed against them. That includes being the special master in charge of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, distributing the millions of dollars donated to those killed and injured in the Virginia Tech shootings, and coming up with a formula to compensate the hundreds of thousands of people affected by the Deepwater Horizon spill. Feinberg himself has likened the difficult moral dilemmas he's faced to Solomon's choices, and yet he's drawn to them again and again. He's written about his unique practice in 2 books, What is Life Worth and Who Gets What? And here to talk with me about his career is Kenneth Feinberg. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And one note, Mr. Feinberg is in Boise as the keynote speaker for the University of Idaho's Law School's Bellwood Lecture, and I thank the organizers of that event for making this conversation possible. Well, as I mentioned, you didn't plan this career. You actually wanted to be an actor when you were a young man. Your dad, an immigrant, said, why don't you think about the law? But in the end, it seems to me that you really have ended up on a big stage. And the stories that you recount in your books of the people that you've listened to, the victims of these awful disasters, it's like reading a play.
I often say that my legal background is at best awash in these matters. I'd be better off, I think, with a divinity degree. You're dealing with human nature in the wake of tragedy. And anybody who thinks that they're prepared to deal with the emotional outlet that follows tragedy, they're in for a rude awakening.
Each of these cases that I recounted in the introduction, and now you've taken on the Penn State case and the shootings in Aurora, Colorado, each brings with it a different twist. But in the end, many of them come down to at least attempting to place a monetary value on a life that was cut short, or one that's going to be lived in a radically different way because somebody is injured. In other societies, money is not the compensation. Sometimes it's an apology, sometimes it's a truth and reconciliation, sometimes it's some property. It almost seems callous sometimes to do this, to put a monetary value on a life. Well, but it's our society, isn't it?
That is our society, and every day, in every court in Idaho and the rest of the country, judges and juries do just that. They listen to the evidence, they get instructed on the law, and then they place a dollar sign next to the victim or the victim's family. And that's always the way it's been in the United States, going back to the founding of the Republic in the 18th century.
Nothing could have prepared you to listen to the stories of the 9/11 victims' families. This was new territory, uncharted territory. And I know you've admitted in both of the books that you wrote that you made some mistakes in the beginning, a little bit too professorial maybe. How in the end were you as an individual able to get through that? 33 months, I believe, of working on that case, trying to figure out compensation?
Well, it was very, very difficult because every day you hear heart-wrenching information, testimony, stories from the 9/11 victims and their families. And you realize that you have been asked by the President of the United States and the Attorney General of the United States and the Congress This is a program. We're setting it up. We've designated you, Ken. We have confidence in you. You feel a real professional obligation to try and do the job as best you can. Now, I benefited from a national outpouring of support from the American people. This was a very apolitical undertaking after 9/11, and a very loving family that supported me 100%. And I had my secret weapon, which I write about in the books, classical music, opera, symphonies. Practically every night I would try and find some concert somewhere that I could just go, listen, fall asleep, and try and clear my head.
You were essentially given carte blanche. There was no limit cap on the amount of money that you could give away, but you felt an obligation not to open up the treasury, as you say in the book. And you had to abide by tort law in the sense of when it came to the economic loss that a family experienced, you were going to have to give the family of a stockbroker more than the family of the busboy. But that's not something that you're ultimately comfortable with, even though you tried to bring the far end and the low end closer together. And you wouldn't recommend it in other cases, would you?
No, you see, the 9/11 fund and the BP oil spill fund were unique because those programs were voluntary. Every claimant who was eligible to get money from these funds had to waive their right to litigate. We will not sue the airlines. We will not sue the World Trade Center. We will not sue Boeing that made the cockpit door. In return for receiving this money, we waive our right to sue. Well, the minute you do that, as Congress did, the minute you do that, you guarantee that the stockbroker, the banker, will get more money than the waiter, the busboy, the fireman, the cop, the soldier, because they make more money. And to voluntarily get them to withdraw their litigation right, you have to tempt them. That was the whole purpose of the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. Let's try and voluntarily convince claimants, don't hire a lawyer, don't sue, instead come into a very, very generous fund. It promoted tremendous divisiveness because survivors did not understand why their next door neighbor was getting $1, $2, $3 million more than they were.
Well, when it came to non-economic loss, pain and suffering, you had a blanket formula that you applied. And I guess for other situations like this, is it your recommendation going forward, God forbid, there should be another tragedy like this, but that money be more equitably distributed?
Yes.
Okay.
As I've explained, I don't think it's a good idea when you set up these compensation programs, which are flawed to begin with as a matter of public policy. They are flawed. But when you do set up one of these programs, try not to tie it to the hip of the tort system, as you said it at the beginning. Instead of following tort law and tort principles, do what we did with Virginia Tech, or what I anticipate we'll do in Aurora, Colorado. Give everybody the same amount of money, regardless of circumstance. All lives are equal. And don't tie it to the tort system. If people want to take that money and go and sue in court, let them. But get the money out the door as quickly as possible, without restriction, in a much more equitable fashion.
Which in fact happened with Virginia Tech. Those were voluntary donations that were made, and you had a formula, but essentially you split it up, and if somebody wanted to use that money to sue the university, they could go ahead and do it. But what you find is a lot of people who come into these compensation programs and feel at least that they've been treated equitably or somewhat fairly don't go on and sue, even if they're given the opportunity.
It is a very interesting point you just made. I found in Virginia Tech, we paid about 100 people, dead, physically injured, about 100 people. Only 2 decided to take the money and then litigate against Virginia Tech. There was a sense, as you point out, There was a sense that the Virginia Tech community in Blacksburg, Virginia, had treated everybody fairly, that there weren't invidious distinctions made among claimants, and why will we sue? Let's not sue the university. We've received compensation, and let's leave it at that. It's an interesting point.
Going back to your talking about how these are one-offs, or they're not changing law, they're set up for special situations. There are attorneys, though, that have criticized the growing number of these settlement cases as somehow doing damage to the justice system, pressuring people to settle and not going into the justice system, not hiring an attorney. This came up over and over again in the Deepwater Horizon case, where lawyers were saying, hey, you're pressuring folks to settle. They should go through the justice system.
Perfectly understandable. Perfectly understandable criticism from lawyers trained in good faith, trained in our rule of law, our legal system, our courts, to lawyers trained in law school. The courts and lawsuits are part of American life. They guarantee justice. This is the way they feel. These programs that they criticize, I try to explain to them, they're no threat to your way of life. They are so rare. They are so unique and unprecedented. They respond to very limited, unique situations, like a horrible oil spill or an unprecedented terrorist attack from abroad. Fear not. They are not a precedent, and once they are used, they disappear and are part of history rather than any precedent for the future.
You mentioned earlier that although you've been in charge of several of these compensation programs, you don't really think that they're a good thing. So why do you keep taking the cases?
You try saying no to President Bush or President Obama. I try and explain to people, I don't decide to create these programs. Policymakers, a judge, the Congress, a White House, they decide they want to do it as a reflection of community empathy for the victims. Fine. If I'm them asked, I think what I've done, millions of Americans would do the same thing. It's not rocket science what I do. It is a desire in the public interest to respond to a request from your president or your attorney general or the Congress. So you do it.
How do you make those decisions? For instance, you said you've just taken on the Penn State situation. Again, the university looking at potentially settling with the victims in the Sandusky situation, presumably so that they won't sue the institution. You must be deluged with offers. How do you decide what to take?
First of all, I'm not deluged.
Really?
Thank goodness.
Okay.
Thank goodness. Auroras don't happen every day. This horrible Penn State situation is rather unique in an institution. If I get a call and there's a request, it's the president of Penn State calling. If I can help, accelerate resolution so that everybody, victims, the school, can move forward. Governor Hickenlooper called me from Colorado. Ken, can you please come out here? We have $5 million. We'd like to distribute it in an equitable way to the victims of the shootings. Glad to help the citizens of Colorado if I can. So I don't look for these assignments. They don't come along, thank goodness, all that often. But when I'm asked to do it, I do what I think a lot of Americans would do.
Could you tell people a little bit about your growing up in Brockton in Massachusetts, the child of two working class Jewish immigrants, yes? And how that informs your decisions about what to take for cases and how you then administer those cases.
I grew up in urban, blue-collar Brockton after World War II, a time of great optimism, assimilation, a time where Americans believed that through hard work and ingenuity and creativity and discipline, you could succeed. But I also grew up in a community with a great communitarian ethic. The notion that you should give back to the community that gives you such hope and stability. And I also grew up, and you know this, I grew up at a time where the favorite son of Massachusetts, President John F. Kennedy, was urging Americans, especially young people, to help their country, give something back to the country. I never lost that sense of Brockton, blue collar, help your neighbor. And I think it has stood me in good stead. I reject the notion today that government is evil, that government is bad. I think government has a very, very important role to play in our country in making everybody's life better and providing everybody some degree of economic security and stability. And that's always stayed with me.
And occasionally salving the wounds of people who were harmed, that there's a government role for that.
The 9/11 victim you want to talk about a great government program. 13 days after 9/11, Congress passed a law, and the law said anybody who died on 9/11, their families, airplanes, World Trade Center, Pentagon, anybody who was physically injured can be paid compensation from the public taxpayer monies. This is all public community money. And over 33 months, we distributed in that fund about $7 billion. And to this day, I get stopped all the time at airports in Boise and elsewhere. Mr. Feinberg, wonderful. We really wanted to help those folks. It was a wonderful thing to do. And I point with pride as to that example of sound government policy.
Very briefly, you mentioned President Kennedy. You worked for his brother, Senator Kennedy. Through that relationship, you met an Idahoan, Senator Frank Church.
Great senator.
Did you work together on the Foreign Intelligence, the FISA Act?
I worked with Senator Kennedy in the 1970s, around 76, 78, when the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was enacted, and Senator Church played a key role, and a highly, highly regarded senator. I mean, he exuded credibility, thought, quiet policy maker. I think the country misses Senator Kennedy. I think the country misses Senator Church. I think the country misses those senators who sort of vindicated Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, saying that the Senate is not the House. Senators may come from each state, but they're national in scope, and Senator Church was one of those national figures.
I have to say, as I read your books, it came to mind, and maybe you've been asked this before, but why don't you go in and mediate the situation in Congress and see if you can get folks to get along a little bit better and get some work done.
Well, I hope that'll change.
But it's obviously not something that you've been called to do. The 9/11 statute has been reopened. Now it's going to deal with health claims of those who worked at the site, those who lived nearby. Good idea, opening up a Pandora's box?
It's a Pandora's box. It's a close question. On the plus side, it is a good idea because those folks, the first responders, those who might have lived in the vicinity of the World Trade Center, the only reason they didn't get compensated under the original program that I designed is that they didn't even manifest any physical injury until after the statute had expired, so there was nothing I could do. So Congress felt a year and a half ago or so, you know, it's unfair. Feinberg paid all of these people. These folks ought to also be paid. On the other hand, you're reopening a program More money is going to World Trade Center victims. There's no money for Katrina victims. There's no money for Oklahoma City victims. There's no money for Tuscaloosa or Joplin tornado victims. Why these people? Why them and nobody else? Bad things happen to good people every day in this country, and you don't have a 9/11 fund to compensate people. So it raises real policy dilemmas, I think.
On Deepwater Horizon, I know in the book you mentioned one of the toughest things that you've ever had to administer were the claims for that, because you took over a program that was a little bit dodgy to begin with, and now that is also being opened up to additional claims. We don't have a lot of time, but what were you trying to impart in the book about Deepwater? It seemed as if there was a fair amount of fraud that went on there, a little bit more difficult program to administer than the 9/11, just because of the sheer volume of people.
Sheer volume. We received over 1,200,000 claims from 50 states. I checked. I think we got about 50 or 75 from Idaho for the Deepwater Horizon spill. Yeah, from Idaho. And 35 foreign countries, people filed claims. Build it and they will come. I had $20 billion, and BP was touting the program and urging people to file. So the magnitude of the problem was one, and we received about 18,000 claims that we thought were fraudulent, and upon review, sent about 4,000 of those to the Justice Department for prosecution. Big problem in the BP oil spill was, for many, many, many claims, the absence of any proof.
Sure. People being paid under the table and not able to show
Mr. Feinberg, we do things with a handshake down here.
Right.
So why are you making me submit tax returns?
And this is not a mass tort claim, what I'm about to ask you about, but something very important in that is that you were put in charge of executive compensation for some of the companies that fell under the TARP provisions, the bailout, if you want to call it that. And you do not mince words in your book. Who gets what? You call out names, and you say that you're not sure that what you did even had any effect. I was amazed at the temerity. I don't know why, but I really was amazed at the temerity of some of these executives that you talk about in the book, and what they still wanted to get for their salaries even after what happened. But success, not a success?
Oh, it was a success. It was populist revenge, really. Congress, having bailed out 450 companies with TARP assistance, public money, decided, for whatever the reason, that as to those 7 companies that received the most money, we'll let the Treasury Department fix their salaries, their compensation. And Secretary Geithner, President, asked me to do that.
At the same time, not bring the companies down by making the compensation so low that the people would go away.
You want them to repay
yeah, right.
what they borrowed. So I think it worked as far as it went. I think it was sort of a sideshow, but it was the law. We did what the law required. Human nature being what it is, I wasn't surprised that the corporate officials balked at my decisions, made it very personal. Why are you punishing me? I didn't, I wasn't part of the debacle. I didn't cause this, but we got through it.
If I had grown up as one of your children, I'm just thinking now, and I had a dispute that I needed to take to Dad, emotion probably wouldn't have worked too well in your family, right? You got to give me the facts.
I tried that a few times. I'll tell you, it didn't work because, first of all, Dad, leave it at the office. You're home now. There are family issues. Plus, my wife, very supportive, would say, well, you can go ahead and try and mediate that dispute. Just make sure you come out on the side of your son or your daughter. I don't care how you get there, but I'm telling you what the result should be. So,
yeah. You have said in the book that teaching is an incredibly important part of what you do whenever you can. You take the opportunity, and of course you're going to be talking to law students here. Why is the teaching such an important part of your career?
I feel sort of an obligation to give back to the next generation of students, law students or business school students or undergraduates. here are some of the lessons I've learned about public service, about how these programs, compensation programs, work or don't work, the pros and cons. And it's very interesting. I try and explain to students, don't plan too far ahead. Life has a way of changing your best laid plans. And if you think you're going to go in one direction, go for it. But don't expect that life will just fall into line and everything you plan will work out. If I've learned anything over the last 40 years, it is that life has a way of throwing a curveball at everybody. And the road not taken is often the way you end up.
Right, because if you hadn't been friends with somebody, a judge who was working on the Agent Orange case and asked you to take that over and settle it, maybe your career would have been much different.
Yes, and if those planes hadn't hit those buildings, if that oil rig hadn't exploded, if a deranged gunman in Aurora or at Virginia Tech hadn't done the unthinkable, I would be practicing law back in Washington, D.C.
As we wrap up, when you do look at the array of cases you've worked on and you think about your legacy going forward or for your children, what is it that stands out for you? What do you can you look at something right now and say,
we made these programs work? I hope part of my legacy is I brought a little bit, just a small amount of financial comfort to American citizens devastated by unspeakable horror. And I hope my children will, as they grow up and develop their own professional careers, give back something to the country. I think that the country is in sore need of dedicated, committed public servants who can give back to the country all different ways. It doesn't have to be anything like what I'm doing. But I just think that the American people need dedicated help, and I hope that my example will guide my children, at least in part.
Well, thank you very much for sitting on this small stage and talking with me and our viewers. Appreciate it very much. You've been listening to Attorney Kenneth Feinberg. He, among other duties, was the special master in charge of the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund. For Dialogue, I'm Marsha Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.